Story 1. Midnight Ride. I started driving for a rideshare service a few months back for extra cash, mostly night shifts. It was easier, quieter roads, faster trips, and fewer conversations. The occasional drunk or overly rowdy passenger was the worst I expected. But one night, it all changed. It was around midnight when I got a ping for a pickup just outside a cafe right on the outskirts of town. The area was known to be quiet, practically abandoned at night. I almost declined, but I was close enough that the extra cash felt worth it. When I pulled up, I saw her, a woman standing alone under the dim, flickering streetlight, dressed in an oddly vintage-looking dress. It looked old-fashioned, adorned with small, faded floral patterns that looked like something out of an old photo album. As she stepped into the car, a faint smell filled the space, a combination of mothballs and perfume, kind of like a house that hadn't been opened in years. I greeted her, but she didn't respond, only mumbled something that sounded like an address I didn't recognize. My GPS struggled to map the location, but after a few adjustments I figured it out. The destination was out of the city, practically in the middle of nowhere, near the old quarry. I tried to break the silence, asking if she was from around here. She didn't answer, just looked down and adjusted her long dark hair, which hid most of her face. When I looked in the rearview mirror, it felt like she was staring directly at me, even though I couldn't see her eyes. A chill crept down my spine. I turned the music on to break the tension, but she immediately muttered, "Please turn it off," in a voice so cold and distant that I did as she asked without thinking. As we continued, the city lights faded, leaving only the moonlit road and the dark silhouette of trees lining the highway. Soon, the GPS lost its signal, and then she started giving me directions in a hollow, monotone voice. Each "turn here" and "keep going" felt heavier, and it felt like whenever she spoke, the temperature seemed to drop. The windows began to fog up, despite it being a warm night. Finally, we reached a dead-end dirt road, surrounded by overgrown bushes and towering trees that looked like they hadn't seen visitors in decades. I slowed to a stop, unsure of where to go next. "This is it," she whispered, barely louder than a breath. I turned around to tell her we'd arrived, but her seat was empty. My breath got caught in my throat. She couldn't have just vanished. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I glanced at my rearview mirror and my heart practically stopped. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her face fully visible now, but her eyes were empty, hollow, and as dark as the night itself. Her mouth twisted into a smile, and before I could scream, everything went black. When I woke up, I was slumped over in my car, parked at the edge of the old quarry. The passenger seat was empty, but the faint smell of perfume lingered. The engine was dead, and my phone battery was drained. I eventually flagged down a passing car, but I never told anyone the full story, until now. Every time I pass that spot, I see her in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, watching me with those hollow eyes. Story 2. A Call from the Woods. My friend's cabin was supposed to be my escape. The stress of work had been eating at me, and a weekend alone at his secluded cabin sounded like heaven. The place had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, and only an old radio that crackled in and out. It was tucked at the edge of a dense forest, far enough from the nearest town that I'd have all the quiet I needed. Perfect. The first night was bliss. I unpacked, set up a fire, and relaxed on the porch with a book and a cold beer. The forest was beautiful and silent, save for the occasional crackle of a branch or distant hoot of an owl. Then came the second night. Continued reading outside, but as the night deepened, the shadows in the trees seemed to grow thicker. I brushed it off as my eyes adjusting to the darkness. When I glanced up, I noticed something that made my heart skip. A figure, standing at the very edge of the forest, just outside the porch light's reach. Didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there,
watching me. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But as I squinted to see better, I realized that there was something too human about the silhouette. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the creeping unease, and went inside, locking the door firmly behind me. I closed all the curtains, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint scratching sounds at the windows. It was rhythmic, almost gentle, like someone tapping in a slow, deliberate pattern. I stayed still, dazed with sleepiness, hoping it was just tree branches brushing against the cabin. After a while, the scratching stopped and silence returned. The next morning, I decided to inspect the area. But despite the previous night's eerie experience, there were no signs of anyone or anything. The ground was undisturbed, as if no one had been near the cabin. I felt foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. That evening, as darkness fell, I couldn't help but feel on edge. I tried reading, then listening to music, but I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that figure again. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. It moved from window to window, as if something was circling the cabin, looking for a way inside. I grabbed a flashlight, and with my heart pounding, I crept toward the nearest window. Taking a deep breath, I lifted the curtain just enough to peek outside. There it was, the figure, standing only feet away, its face obscured by shadows, yet I felt its gaze penetrate the glass. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight in my rush. By the time I worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. But as I turned, I heard a faint whisper near my ear, so close I felt a chill.
Come outside.
I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed my things and left without a moment's pause. When I told my friend what happened, his face went pale. He said he'd heard people talk about seeing things before, but he never believed it. They claimed to have seen a figure near the cabin, some kind of entity that would lure people back into the woods. His last words to me were a warning. If you hear him calling, don't look back.
Story 3. The South Wing. Working the night shift as a security guard at St. Helena wasn't something I'd planned on doing for long, but I needed the work. It wasn't the busiest place, especially after midnight, when the hum of fluorescent lights was the only consistent sound in the empty halls. Still, the job had its perks: quiet rounds, occasional radio chatter, and the ability to watch a few games or movies on my breaks. But there was one part of the hospital that always put me on edge. The South Wing had been closed off years ago. Rumor had it there was some structural damage and mold issues, so they condemned it until they could secure the funding for renovations. I'd never thought much of it. Hospitals have strange vibes at night anyway, but something about that particular wing felt different. It was colder, I'm sure of it. Every time I passed the doors that led to it, I'd get an inexplicable chill. It started with little things. I'd hear faint sounds coming from that wing, like distant whispers or the soft padding of footsteps. It was easy to dismiss at first. Old buildings creak, and maybe there was a draft. But sometimes the sounds would be too distinct, footsteps that seemed to fall in time with my own, but from just around the corner, always a step ahead or a step behind. My supervisor brushed it off when I mentioned it, and the other guards just shrugged. Ghosts of patients past, one of them joked. I laughed, but it didn't feel funny. One night, I was watching the security cameras from my desk, sipping stale coffee. I glanced at the feed from the South Wing, more out of habit than anything. The camera for that wing showed the corridor, dark and empty as always. But just as I was about to turn away, I noticed a faint movement in the corner of the screen. There was a figure, barely visible, almost blending with the shadows. They stood at the end of the corridor, perfectly still, facing the camera. The figure was tall, with shoulders slightly hunched, and I couldn't make out any features. They seemed to flicker in and out, like a static image on an old TV. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or maybe a glitch in the camera feed. But then it moved. The figure took a step forward, then another, its outline becoming clearer. I could see that its face was obscured, either by shadow or something else, but its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were pitch black, hollow, and unblinking. It felt as if it were looking right at me through the screen. I jumped up and ran down the corridor, my flashlight flickering as I tried to steady my breathing. When I reached the south wing entrance, I stopped, shining my light into the darkness. The door was locked, as it always was, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I checked the cameras again, but the figure was gone, leaving only an empty, lifeless hallway behind. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see that figure standing right behind me. The whispers started again that night, growing louder, more insistent, like a crowd of people murmuring just out of earshot. Every now and then, I'd catch a word or two, but they were never clear enough to make sense. Over the next few nights, the activity grew more intense. Doors would creak open just as I walked by, lights would flicker in rooms I knew were empty, and I began to hear footsteps in the hallway behind me. They would start softly, but then they'd pick up speed, as if someone were rushing toward me, stopping just as I turned around. No one was ever there, but I could feel it. An energy, a presence, something waiting for me to let my guard down. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought it felt like it was pulling me in. Then one night, as I was walking past the south wing, I heard it again. A whisper, closer than ever before. This time, it wasn't just a faint murmur. It was a voice, low and raspy, that seemed to come from right behind me.
You shouldn't have come here.
I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to see the figure inches from my face. But the corridor was empty, bathed in the cold, unforgiving glow of the overhead lights. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I wanted to leave, but I had to know. Maybe if I checked the footage, I'd see something that made sense, something that could explain the figure, the whispers, everything that had been happening. I rushed back to the security office. My heart was pounding. When I rewound the footage, my stomach turned. There, on the screen, was me, walking down the hallway. And behind me, standing just out of reach, was the figure, following me step for step, matching my every movement. At one point, it seemed to reach out, its shadowy hand stretching toward my shoulder, stopping just short of touching me. I shut off the monitor, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But as I sat there, I felt a chill, colder than I'd ever felt before, settle over me. I could sense it, right behind me. My body went rigid, and I could feel a presence, looming, as if someone were leaning over my shoulder, breathing down my neck. Slowly I turned, but nothing was there. Only the empty office, silent and still. But as I stared at the doorway, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, whispering into my ear.
Welcome back.
The next night, I quit without giving notice. I packed my things, left my uniform in the locker, and didn't look back. I'd had enough. A week later, I ran into one of the other guards at the grocery store. He looked pale, tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. "You hear anything strange around there lately?" I asked, half joking. He didn't need to answer me. The fear in his eyes did. I didn't say anything further, just nodded and wished him luck. As I walked away, I heard him mutter something under his breath, something that sent a chill down my spine. They say once you hear the whispers, it's already too late.